The hall looked exactly the way my stepdaughter had described it. Exposed brick, Edison bulbs strung low over the tables, white peonies everywhere. $47,000 worth of white peonies, as it turned out. I remember thinking that when I walked in. Not because I was bitter, just because I had signed the invoice 3 weeks earlier and I still wasn't sure how flowers could cost that much. I was 63 years old, standing at the entrance of a rented banquet hall in Mississauga, wearing the suit my wife had picked out for me, and I was trying very hard to feel like a guest. That was the thing nobody tells you about paying for everything. You still feel like an outsider at your own party. My name is Douglas. I'm a retired civil engineer. I spent 31 years with the same firm in Hamilton, saved carefully, never bought anything I didn't need, and when I met my wife 16 years ago, I walked into a life that had a lot of love in it and a lot of debt underneath. She had 2 children from her first marriage, a son who lived out west and a daughter, Amber, who lived 20 minutes from us, and who had been, from the very first day I met her, politely indifferent to my existence. Not cruel, not openly hostile, just indifferent. The way you are to a piece of furniture that was already in the house when you moved in. Her mother and I married quietly. Small ceremony at City Hall. Dinner after at a place on King Street. My wife had wanted something low-key. I think partly she was embarrassed that her daughter didn't come. Amber had a conflict apparently. A work thing. I didn't push it. I figured time would smooth things over. It had a way of doing that. It didn't really. But it gave us a comfortable fiction to live inside. Over the years I paid for things. Not because anyone asked directly, at least not at first. My wife would mention that Amber was struggling, the rent in the Tobacco had gone up, or the car needed something, or there was a gap between what her job paid and what her life cost. I would write a check or send an e-transfer, and my wife would pass it along, and that would be the end of it. No thank you. No acknowledgement really, just a brief resumption of normal. At some point the requests became less indirect. Amber would call my wife would come to me with a specific number, and I would provide it. I never once said no. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Nobody put a gun to my head. I gave because I could and because it made my wife happy and because some part of me believed that eventually the accumulated weight of all that quiet generosity would register somewhere. When Amber got engaged, I was genuinely glad for her. Her fiancé Marcus was a soft-spoken structural engineer from Brampton, the kind of man who looked you in the eye when he shook your hand and meant it. I liked him immediately. My wife was over the moon. The wedding conversation happened at Sunday dinner, maybe 3 months after the engagement. Amber laid out what she wanted. The venue, the caterer, the photographer, the dress, the flowers. She had a folder, an actual printed folder with tabs. I remember her mother reaching across the table to flick through it, cooing over the photos, and I remember Amber watching me the way you watch a machine you're about to turn on, waiting to see if it runs. The number was $84,000. In Ontario, that is not an outrageous number for a wedding of this scale. 220 guests, full open bar, 5-piece band, late-night poutine station, photo booth, florist, who apparently charged by the stem. It is real money, but it is not fantasy money. I had it. I said I would cover it. Amber nodded. My wife squeezed my hand under the table. That was the moment. No hug from Amber. No real gratitude. Just a nod and then a pivot to discussing the colour scheme for the centerpieces. Over the following 8 months, I paid invoices. That is the honest summary of my involvement in the wedding planning. I paid the venue deposit. I paid the florist, the caterer, the florist, the videographer. I paid for the rehearsal dinner at a restaurant on Queen Street West that charged $38 for a bowl of pasta. I paid for the hotel room block for out-of-town guests. I paid for the shuttle buses. When Amber decided 4 weeks before the wedding that she wanted live ceremony music instead of a playlist, I paid the string quartet. I was never consulted. I was invoiced. My wife would tell me about the decisions afterwards sometimes if they involved a significant change in cost, but my input was not sought on anything, not the menu, not the seating arrangement, not the order of the program. I was the account the bills were drawn from, and that was the extent of my function. Marcus noticed. I could tell from the way he sometimes looked at me across a room, a kind of quiet apology in his eyes, like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure he had the standing to say it. We had coffee alone once, about a month before the wedding, and he said he appreciated everything I was doing, that it meant a lot to him, that he hoped I knew that. I told him it was my pleasure. He looked at me for a moment and then nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they hear something that is technically true, but not the whole truth. The wedding day itself was beautiful. I will say that. The venue looked exactly right. The weather held. The flowers, all $47,000 of them, filled the room with something that smelled like late summer. My wife was radiant. Even Amber, who I had rarely seen unguarded, looked genuinely happy walking down the aisle. I stood in the third row and watched her, and I thought, this is enough. This is what it was for. The ceremony was at 4 o'clock. The reception began at 6. By 7:30, the toasts had started. Amber's mother went first. She talked about Amber as a little girl, about watching her grow up, about how proud she was. It was warm and funny and exactly right. There were tears. I was one of the people who cried, if I'm being honest. Then Amber's maid of honor went. Then Marcus's best man. All of it lovely. Then Amber's grandmother stood up. She was 78, a small, sharp woman from Scarborough who had never in 16 years addressed me by name. She had a glass of Pinot in one hand and the microphone in the other, and she began talking about family, about what family meant, about how Amber had always had a strong foundation of people who loved her. She listed those people. She listed Amber's mother. She listed her own late husband, Amber's grandfather. She listed Amber's brother, who had flown in from Kelowna. She listed 2 aunts and a family friend who had known Amber since kindergarten. She did not list me. She was talking about the wedding itself now, about how wonderful it was, how Amber deserved every bit of it. And then she smiled and said, and of course, a wedding like this doesn't just happen. It takes a village. She laughed. We all chipped in, didn't we? The table nearest to her laughed along. My wife, seated beside me, went very still. I don't know if it was deliberate. I genuinely don't know that, even now. But what I know is that the grandmother had been present at the dinner, where I committed to paying for the entire wedding. She had been sitting 2 seats away from me. She had heard the number, and she had nodded and gone back to her salad. And now she was standing at a microphone in a room I had paid for, at a dinner I had paid for, telling 220 people that the village had chipped in. I took a sip of water. And then Amber's cousin, a man in his early 40s, who I had met perhaps 4 times, leaned over to the person beside him and said something. He said it quietly, but the room had just gone to applause for the grandmother, and the sound dropped suddenly and his voice carried. He said, well, the stepfather probably chipped in too. A little something, you know how it is. He was smiling when he said it. The kind of smile that treats cruelty as wit. The table laughed. My wife put her hand on my arm. I looked at Amber. She was looking at the centerpiece. And then, because she must have felt me looking, she glanced up. Our eyes met for just a moment, and she smiled. Not at me. Just a reflexive smile, the kind that happens when a room is laughing and you're part of the room. It lasted about 2 seconds. It was the 2 seconds that broke something in me. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the way a thing that has been under slow pressure for a very long time finally gives way. I set my water glass down. And then Marcus stood up. He hadn't been scheduled to speak until later, after dinner. But he picked up his glass, and he stood, and the room quieted because he was the groom. And grooms can stand up whenever they want. He said, I need to say something before we go any further. His voice was even. Calm the way water is calm when it's very deep. Some of you know Douglas. A lot of you probably don't, because Douglas is not the kind of man who makes sure you know him. He's the kind of man who just handles things. He paused. He paid for this wedding. All of it. Every invoice, every deposit, every upgrade Amber and I asked for between October and today. He never complained. He never asked for anything in return. He never asked to have his name on anything. Another pause. I've been watching this room all night, and I want to make sure that at least once this evening, someone says his name out loud and tells him directly, thank you. What you did was not a small thing. It was not a chip-in. It was an extraordinary act of love for a family that," he stopped, seemed to choose his next word carefully, "that hasn't always made it easy." The room was absolutely silent. I was looking at the table. I heard my wife make a sound beside me, something soft. Marcus raised his glass. "To Douglas." A few people echoed it. Not the whole room. Some people were confused. Some hadn't heard the cousin's comment. Some didn't know the context. But enough people said it that it rang out. My wife was gripping my hand now. I could feel her shaking slightly. I finally looked up and found Marcus. He held my gaze. 40 years younger than me, standing in his rented tuxedo, and he looked steadier in that moment than anyone I'd seen in a very long time. I nodded at him. That was all I could manage. The dinner continued, the band played, people danced. On the surface, the evening proceeded entirely normally, but I had gone somewhere quiet inside myself, the way you do when something has shifted and you need time to figure out what it means. Amber did not come to my table that night. Not after the toast, not during dinner, not during the dancing. I watched her move through the room, stopping at every other table, laughing, hugging, posing for photos. She went to the table where her grandmother was sitting and held the old woman's face in both hands and kissed her cheek. She passed within 6 feet of me twice without stopping. My wife noticed. She said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. At 10 o'clock, I told her I needed some air and stepped outside. The venue had a small patio that faced the parking lot, not romantic, but the air was cool and it was quiet and I could hear myself think. A few other guests were out there smoking. I stood at the railing and looked at the cars, and I thought about the 8 months since that Sunday dinner. I thought about every invoice. I thought about the rehearsal dinner and the string quartet and the $47,000 in flowers. I thought about my wife squeezing my hand under the table when I said yes. I thought about the grandmother's speech and the cousin's smile and Amber looking at the centerpiece. And I thought about Marcus standing up. He hadn't had to do that. Nobody had asked him to. There was no version of that moment that was easy for him. It was his wedding night, and he had just publicly corrected his new wife's family. Whatever that would cost him later, he had paid it anyway, on the spot, without hesitation. That was integrity. That was a person deciding who he was going to be, right then, in real time, with 200 people watching. I stayed outside for about 20 minutes. When I went back in, I found my wife and I told her I wanted to leave soon. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I know." She said it the way people say things when they mean more than the words. We left at 11. We said goodbye to Marcus and he hugged me. A real hug, the kind that means something. We found Amber near the bar and she gave my wife a long embrace and then turned to me and said quite formally, "Thank you for everything, Douglas," like I was a vendor, like she was ticking a box. I said, "I hope you two are very happy." I meant the part about Marcus. In the car on the way home, my wife and I didn't speak for a long time. The highway was quiet. The city lights spread out on either side of us, and I watched them and felt the strange flatness that comes after a very long tension finally releases. Eventually she said, "I'm sorry." I said, "You don't need to apologize for other people." She said, "I know, but I'm sorry anyway." I reached over and took her hand on the center console and we drove the rest of the way home like that. What happened in the weeks after is less dramatic than you might expect. There were no big confrontations, no screaming matches, no ultimatums delivered at kitchen tables. That is not who my wife and I are. But I made some changes. I told my wife, quietly and without anger, that I would not be providing financial support to Amber any longer. Not as punishment, not as a withdrawal of love, just as a return to reality, the reality that Amber was a grown woman in her 30s with a husband, and that what I had done for 16 years had not built the relationship I had hoped it would, and that continuing it would only be a way of paying for something that wasn't being offered in return. My wife listened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think you're right." I hadn't expected that. I had braced myself for defense, for the usual complicated negotiation that happens when a mother is caught between a husband and a child. But she said it clearly. I think you're right. She told me later that she had seen the cousin's comment land on me, that she had watched my face, that she had made her own reckoning in those 2 seconds sitting beside me. Marcus called me about 3 weeks after the wedding. He thanked me again, more quietly this time, without a room full of people listening. He said he and Amber were doing well, settling into the new place in Burlington. He said he hoped we could have dinner sometime, the four of us, and start fresh. I told him I would like that very much. Amber sent a card about a month later. It was a thank you card, the kind you buy in packs at Shoppers, and she had written 4 lines inside. She thanked me for my generosity. She said it meant a lot to have the wedding she had dreamed of. She hoped we could get together soon. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't address what had happened. I read the card twice and then put it on the counter and made myself a cup of tea. I thought about writing back. I thought about it for several days, actually. I drafted things in my head while I was on my morning walks along the trail by the lake. Different versions, some warmer, some that said more. Eventually I wrote a single short note. I said I was glad the day had been beautiful. I said I wished her and Marcus well. I said I was looking forward to getting to know them better. I didn't mention the rest of it. That's not my style. Maybe that's a flaw. Maybe I should have said more. But I think I was old enough by then to know that some things get said by how you live going forward, not by what you write in a note. It's been nearly 8 months now. My wife and I still have Sunday dinners. Sometimes Marcus comes alone if Amber is working or not feeling social, and the 3 of us eat and talk about nothing important, and it is genuinely pleasant. He is a good man. I am glad she married him. I am glad she married him. I hope he knows that. Amber and I are polite, carefully, watchfully polite. There is something there that has been set down and has not been picked back up. Maybe it will be, eventually. I don't know. I am 63 years old, and I've learned that some distances close slowly and some don't close at all, and that the most useful thing you can do is stop pretending the distance isn't there. What I know is this: I paid for a wedding. I sat in a room full of people I had made possible being there, and I was thanked by exactly one person, and he was not anyone who was obligated to thank me. He was a young man who had not known me a year ago, who saw something that the people who had known me 16 years had stopped seeing, and who chose to stand up and say it out loud in front of everyone. I think about that sometimes, not with bitterness, more with a kind of wondering, at how clearly some people see, and how little it costs to make someone feel visible, and how rarely anyone bothers. When Marcus hugged me on the way out that night, he said one more thing. He said, "You deserved better than you got." It's a small thing to say. 5 words. But I had been a civil engineer for 31 years, and I had built things that stood up, and not many people had ever said anything like that to me. I got in the car, and I told my wife to drive. I looked straight ahead at the highway, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like myself again. I keep thinking about the cousin's smile, not the words, the smile. That particular kind of smile that dresses itself up as a joke so that nobody can call it what it actually is. I've seen it before, in different rooms on different faces. It's the smile of someone who knows exactly what they're doing and has decided to do it anyway, because the room will laugh and the moment will pass and the person on the receiving end will say nothing. I said nothing, and I've spent some time asking myself what that means about me. What I've come to is this: there is a difference between patience and passivity, and I spent about 16 years confusing the two. I told myself I was being generous, being the bigger person, letting small things go because that's what adults do in families. But honesty is its own kind of courage, and I wasn't being honest. I was avoiding. I was paying invoices, literal and otherwise, instead of having the harder conversations. That's not generosity. That's a way of keeping the peace by never actually making it. Marcus understood something I had lost sight of. He understood that your character isn't what you plan to show in better circumstances. It's what you do in the exact room you're standing in, with the exact people watching. He was 29 years old at his own wedding reception, and he chose, clearly and without hesitation, to do the right thing, even though it cost him something real. That takes a kind of moral clarity that isn't common. It's the kind of clarity that comes from knowing who you are and deciding quietly that you're going to stay that way regardless of what the room wants from you. I think about that a lot, about what it means to actually know your own values well enough to act on them under pressure. Not in theory, not in a journal. In a moment when the music has just stopped and 200 people are watching, and the easy thing, the socially safe thing, is to sit down and let it go. I didn't have that clarity for most of those 16 years. I thought that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, stayed patient enough, eventually things would balance out on their own. They didn't. And the reason they didn't isn't complicated. The people around me had no reason to change because there were no real consequences. I had made myself very easy to take for granted. That was my part in it. Owning that isn't comfortable, but it's the only way the story becomes useful instead of just painful. What I know now, at 63, is that quiet strength isn't the same as quiet suffering. Real strength, the kind Marcus showed that night, the kind I eventually found on the drive home, is knowing when to stop absorbing and start being clear about what you'll accept, about what you won't, about who you actually are when no one's thanking you for it. You can be decent and still have limits. You can be generous and still expect to be seen. Those two things are not in conflict. I feel lighter now, not because everything is resolved, it isn't, but because I finally stopped waiting for the room to give me permission to take up space in it.